All right, picking up where we left off, we are at Chapter 1, the Capitalist System of Society. The first part of this section is titled Commodity Production. If we examine closely the manner in which production is developed under capitalism, we see that in that system commodities are produced. Well, what is remarkable there in that, someone will say? The remarkable thing about it is that the article is not merely a product of labor, but is a product which is produced for the market. An article is not a commodity when it is produced for the use of the maker. When a farmer sows corn, reaps, threshes, and grinds it, and then makes it into a bread to be eaten by himself, that bread is not a commodity, it is simply bread. An article becomes a commodity only when it is bought and sold, that is, when it is introduced and produced for the market system. In the capitalist system of society, all articles are produced for the market. As such, they are all commodities. Every factory, every workshop usually produces only a certain few commodities. One can easily see that in cases of this kind, the wares are not produced for personal use. When a funeral undertaker carries on a business for the manufacturing of coffins, it is clear that the coffins are not produced for himself or his family, but for the market. When a manufacturer produces castor oil, it is evident that even if he took some every day in a desire to guard against indigestion, he could use only the very smallest portion of castor oil that his factory produces. Under capitalism, it is exactly the same with all other products. In a button factory, countless buttons are made, but these buttons are not made to be sewn on the clothes of the manufacturer, they're for sale. Everything that is produced in capitalist society is intended for the market. To the market comes gloves, sausages, books, boot polish, machinery, spirits, bread, guns, in short, everything. Commodity production presupposes private property. The handcraftsmen and tradesmen who produce commodities own their own workshops and tools. The manufacturer and works proprietor own the factory and the works, with all buildings, machinery, and other property. As soon as private property and commodity production appear, there is a struggle for purchasers, or competition among the sellers. When there were no manufacturers or great capitalists, but only handcraftsmen, there was also a struggle for consumers, as he who was the strongest or most skillful, he who possessed the best tools, and above all, he who had gathered together a little money, always succeeded in securing the customers and outdistancing his rivals. The small private property of the handicraftsman, therefore, contained the germ of the great private property of today. The first remarkable characteristic of the capitalist system of society is, therefore, commodity production, that is, production for the market. The second section of the first chapter is monopoly of the means of production by the capitalist class. To realize the nature of capitalism, it is not sufficient merely to cite one of its characteristics. There can be a system of commodity production which is not necessarily capitalist. For example, the handicraft system. A handicraftsman works for a market and sells his produce there. The products are therefore commodities, and the whole system is a commodity-producing system. In spite of this, however, the system is not a capitalist one, but a mere system of commodity production. Before this simple system can become capitalistic, the means of production, the tools, the machines, the buildings, the land, etc., must first pass into the possession of a small class of rich capitalists, and on the other hand, the numerous independent handicraftsmen and peasants must be degraded to the position of workers. We have already seen that the simple system of commodity production contains within itself the germ of its own destruction and that of the birth of another system. That has actually come to pass. In all countries, the handicraftsman and the small master have for the most part disappeared. The poorer amongst them sold their tools, and from being masters became men who possessed nothing but a pair of hands. Those who were somewhat better off still became richer. They rebuilt their workshops, extended them, introduced better fittings and later machinery, and began to engage workers and became manufacturers. Gradually, they acquired possession of everything necessary for production: factory buildings, raw materials, warehouses, shops, works, mines, railways, steamships, in short, everything indispensable to production. All these instruments of production became the exclusive property of the capitalist class. A small handful of rich men possess everything. The majority of the poor possess only the power of their own labor. This monopoly possession by the capitalist class of the means of production is the second characteristic of the capitalist system of society. Section 3 is wage labor. The numerous class of men who were not left in possession of any property became wage workers under capitalism. What was the impoverished peasant or handicraftsman to do? He could either hire himself as a slave to a capitalist landlord, or go into town and enter a factory as a wage worker. There was no other course. He chose the latter course, and thus originated wage labor, the third characteristic of the capitalist system of society. What then is wage labor? Formerly, in the period of slavery, the slave owner could buy and sell the slaves. Men with all the attributes of men were the private property of other men. The owner could beat his slave to death in a drunken fit, just as he might destroy a piece of furniture. The slave was simply a thing. The ancient Romans actually divided all property, which was necessary for production, into things, or workers, beasts of burden, or half-articulate workers, and speaking articulate workers, being male slaves. The shovel, ox, and the slave were alike in the eyes of the owner. They were all merely instruments of labor, which could be bought, sold, or destroyed. Under wage labor, the man himself is neither bought nor sold. However, what is bought and sold is his labor power, not him himself. Thus, the wage laborer is free in person, in theory. The capitalist cannot beat him or sell him to another, or exchange him for a young hound, as a slave owner could do with a slave. The worker is merely hired. It even appears as if capitalist and worker were equal. If you do not want to work, well, do not come to work. No one will compel you to do so, say the employers. They even assert that they keep the workers alive because they are giving them employment. In reality, workers and capitalists live under different conditions. The workers are haunted by the fear of starvation. It is hunger that compels them to hire themselves to the employers, that is, to sell their labor power. There is no other way out. With bare hands alone, no private production can be carried on. Try to forge steel or weave, or build wagons without machinery and tools. Under capitalism, the land itself is in private hands. It is impossible to even find a spot on which to start an industry. The freedom of the worker to sell his labor power, and the freedom of the capitalist to buy it, this so-called equality of capitalists and workers. All this simply means is that the workers, in order to escape starvation, are compelled to work for the capitalists. Consequently, the essence of wage labor consists in the sale of labor power, or in the transformation of labor power into commodities. In the simple system of production of which we have spoken, milk, bread, raw materials, boots, etc. could be found upon the market, but not labor power. Labor power was not sold. Its possessor, the handicraftsman, possessed a house and tools. He worked himself and carried on his own industry, exerting his own labor power in service of his own business. Under capitalism, it is quite different. He who works possesses no means of production. He cannot exert his labor power in his own business. In order to escape starvation, he must sell his labor power to the capitalist. Near the market, where wool, cheese, or machines are sold, rises the labor market where the proletarians, i.e. the wage laborers, sell their labor power. Consequently, the capitalist system is distinguished from the simple system of commodity production by the fact that in the capitalist system, wage labor itself is turned into a commodity. Wage labor appears, therefore, as the third characteristic of the capitalist system. The next section is conditions of capitalist production. The distinguishing marks of the capitalist system are therefore three in number: production for the market, i.e. commodity production, monopoly of the means of production by the capitalist class, and wage labor, that is, labor based upon the sale of labor power. All of these characteristics are connected to the question, in what relation do men stand to one another when they engage in the manufacture and distribution of commodities? What do we mean by the term commodity production, or production for the market? We mean that men work for one another, but each produces for the market without knowing beforehand who will purchase this product. Let us take, for example, a worker A and a peasant B. A takes boots that he has made to the market and sells them to B. With this money, he buys bread from B. When A went to the market, he did not know that he would meet B, and when B went, he did not know that he would meet A. When A has bought the bread and B the boots, it appears that B has worked for A and A for B without knowing it. The operations of the market have concealed the fact that each has worked for the other, and that without the other neither could live. In a system of commodity production, men who work for and independently of one another, and in an unorganized manner, without even knowing what relation they bear to one another. In commodity production, therefore, the parts played by men are allotted in a particular way, and men stand in a certain relationship to one another. To speak of the monopoly of the means of production, or wage labor, is to speak of mutual relations of men. What does monopoly mean? It means that the workers produce goods with instruments of production that are not owned by themselves, and that the goods, when produced, belong to the owners of the instruments. In short, the question is one of mutual relations of men during the process of production. These are called the conditions of production. It is not difficult to see that the conditions of production were not always of this kind. A long time ago, men lived in small communities, working communally together, hunting, fishing, gathering fruits, roots, etc., and divided things amongst themselves. That was one kind of condition of production. When slavery existed, there were other conditions of production. Under capitalism, there are still others. There can be, therefore, different kinds of conditions of production. These kinds of conditions of production are called the economic structure of society or the mode of production. The capitalist conditions of production, or what is the same thing, the capitalist structure of society, or the capitalist mode of production, are the relations of men in a system of commodity production, where we find, on the one hand, a handful of capitalists in exclusive possession of the means of production, and on the other hand, the wage labor of the working class. The next section is the exploitation of the workers. The question arises, why do capitalists engage working men? Everyone knows that capitalists engage workmen not from a desire to feed them, but from a desire to extract profits from them. The thirst for profit causes the capitalist to build his factory and impels him to haunt around everywhere to see where he can find the highest rate. The getting of profit wholly absorbs him. And here a very interesting feature of the capitalist system reveals itself. Under this system are produced not those things which are useful, but those things for which high prices will be paid, and from which, therefore, large profits will be obtained. For example, strong drink is an injurious thing, and should be produced only for technical work or medicinal purposes. But throughout the world, capitalists are engaged with all of their might in its production. Why is this? Because from the people's desire for a drink, a great profit can be made. We must now make it clear how profit arises. The capitalist receives his profit in the form of money when he sells the articles which have been produced in his factory. How much money does he receive for his goods? Or in other words, what is the price of the goods? How is the price determined? Why is the price of one article high and that of another low? It is not difficult to see that in consequence of the introduction of new machinery into certain branches of production, labor becomes even more productive, or, in other words, goods are produced more easily and the price of the commodities go down. If, on the other hand, production becomes more difficult and fewer wares are produced, or, in other words, labor is less productive, the prices of the commodities will rise. We will stop here for now and pick up again here at the next section in the next video.